Butter, butter, toil and trouble. Recurring themes of dairy theft in Irish witchcraft folklore. Witches and butter. In modern-day North America, the word witch conjures up images of women in black pointy hats flying on broomsticks with their black cats. One word which may not come to mind immediately is butter. However, according to the Irish Folklore Commission's Schools collection, belief in witches in Ireland involves an important association with dairy theft and May Day. The reason for this phenomenon and its implications involve Ireland's pre-Christian and early modern history. By examining several stories from this collection, as well as secondary sources about witchcraft and Irish customs, we will attempt to better understand the role of witches and butter in Irish folk history. In the school's collection, there are several entries that mention witches, and many, a likely majority, make reference to one or more of the following themes: butter, milk, and churning, May Day, and hares, cows, farm animals. Here are a few typical examples. About 15 years ago, there were a lot of old witches in this district. They used to play a lot of tricks on the people. If they wanted to do harm to the people, they could do it without any difficulty. The witches were generally in the form of women, but around Ballyfour there was one in the form of a hare. One of the witches about here had the bones of a jet black on which there was not a stream of white. With these she could do whatever she liked. Anyone that would give her some new milk, she could take the butter off it. Another of them would go out on a May morning at sunrise and pull herbs out of the ground. She would have these for the whole year round. If anyone interfered with her, she could strike them with a sudden sickness. No doctor or specialist would be able to know what would be on them. Another example, titled Churning, goes like this. Long ago, there used to be witches in Ireland. They used to go out every morning early, and in the evening, before people milked the cows, they milked them in a certain way so that they could all the cream of the milk, and they brought it away with them to the place where they lived. When the people would come to milk, they wondered why the cows would not have much milk, and they would be a long time getting a churning. A third example, titled Witchcraft, goes like this. It appears that about 80 or 100 years ago, there was a kind of witchcraft or charm setting carried on in the rural parts of this country. It was believed that by charms or spells worked on May Eve, that the butter of cows so charmed would be the property of the charmer for the ensuing year. Even though the owners of the cows were churning for months, they could never make butter. From these examples, the theme of agrarian anxiety over dairy production and animal husbandry, especially on May Day, become evident. Let us further explore the use and origin of these tropes, specifically the recurring stories of supernatural butter thievery. The main goal of these rural witches seems to be acquiring dairy products through nefarious means. The obvious question is, why would powerful evil beings want butter and milk and not something else like coins or children? The answer may lie partly in the long history and importance of butter in Ireland. In early Ireland, cows and milk were a huge part of the economy, with butter being used to pay the food rent to lords, while milk was the main staple of the Irish peasant diet. There is even folklore around ancient stones called butter stones, which are thought to have been used by pre-Christian dairies. With this long history of status and importance to Irish culture, it makes sense that witches would desire butter, as it can be seen as a placeholder for general wealth and bounty. If churning wasn't working properly or the butter wouldn't break, Irish farmers would blame supernatural forces, even though we know now there were many reasons butter could not be produced from milk, such as temperature control, sterilization issues, and not separating the cream. This long history reveals the importance and value of dairy production in Irish culture and explains the large amount of resulting folklore around it. May Day is a recurring theme in these tales, and it seems the summer celebration was an especially dangerous time for Irish farmers. May Day is closely associated with the pre-Christian holiday of Beltane, which celebrated the midpoint between the winter and summer equinox and the beginning of summer. In an agricultural society like early Ireland, this festival marked the moving of livestock to summer pastures and the lighting of bonfires. explaining the preoccupation with livestock and their location in the school's collection stories that we see today. As Frédéric Amaro remarks in his article, The Women of Beltane, From the Maiden to the Witch, women and butter thieving incidents on Beltane are inextricably linked. Amaro also stresses the importance of Beltane and Samhain as the two most important days of the year to pre-Christian Ireland. They marked the passing of the agricultural year and all the good or bad luck that would come with it. Perhaps it is due to this liminal nature that Irish farmers sought to take steps ensuring a bountiful year on May Day. We see these agrarian anxieties and folk remedies reflected in the school's collection. In an untitled story, we are told of a pishogue or curse that was used to steal butter. Another pishogue that was that known as turning under a briar. This was considered real devilment and was supposed to confer great powers. This was a trick used by those people who stole the butter from their neighbors on May morning. The same story speaks about a witch in the form of a hare. Farmers hated to see a hare among the cows on May morning, for it was commonly known that certain women empowered by the devil used to go about as hares stealing butter. Mrs. Crowley says that this was a fact. Another story called May Day Customs begins by detailing enchanting rituals that involve placing flowers and presents under a bush, but changes tone suddenly to describe witches and their association with butter and May Day once again. Long ago, on May Eve, the women used to turn themselves into witches and parade around about the district with churn dashes on their shoulders. There was a woman who went in the parade on May Eve, and the next morning she was found dead in her on byre. The man that I heard this story from said that these witches used to work some magic so that when their neighbors would churn, they would have no butter on their milk. The story titled Superstitions contains themes we are familiar with by now as well. There is a custom that on the 1st of May the people do not rise until near dinner time, because it is said the first smoke up will attract the witches, and it is said the witches would come and steal all their milk and butter for that year. Interestingly, it seems that the Irish had a different response to the threats of witchcraft than Britain or the rest of Europe. In his article, Witchcraft, Belief and Trials in Early Modern Ireland, Andrew Snedden explains how out of over 40,000 people put to death for witchcraft in Europe between 1400 and 1800, Ireland's death count most likely didn't reach double figures. Snedden points out that Ireland's legal framework for dealing with witches was identical to England's and Scotland's, and yet it was employed much less. He argues the reason for this was that Ireland had a deep-rooted practice of preventative and restorative folk remedies, which seemed to be the preferred tactic of Irish peasants over the courts. One example of the employment of such folk remedies can be seen in the story The Horned Woman, which, although it doesn't contain references to butter, details the many ways one can protect oneself from a witch. The spirit of the well bade the mistress of the house to enter and prepare her home against the enchantments of the witches if they returned again. And first, to break their spells, she sprinkled the water in which she had washed her child's feet outside the door on the threshold. Secondly, she took the cake which the witches had made in her absence, of meal mixed with the blood drawn from the sleeping family. And she broke the cake in its bits and placed a bit in the mouth of each sleeper, and they were restored. And she took the cloth they had woven and placed it half in and half out of the chest with the padlock. As well, many of the stories we have already seen contain these folk remedies within them. For example, in the story Witchcraft, it says, "It is hard to believe. Nevertheless, there are some farmers up to this day who keep their cows inside on May Eve and lock the stall door." This recalls the information we were learning about moving cattle on Beltane, moving livestock to their summer pastures on Beltane. In the story Superstitions, there is a custom that on the 1st of May, the people do not rise until near dinner time. That was their folk remedy way of preventing witches from seeing their fire, being the first fire lit, and therefore being a target for butter thievery. And finally, in churning, a common superstition throughout the locality was that if a man lit his pipe while churning was in progress in the house, he brought the butter, unless he left some of the ash from the pipe under the churn. Other butter-related folk remedies have been collected in the article Butter Stealing Through Magic, Fears of an Agrarian Society, such as items being placed beneath the churn, hot coals, or the shoe of an ass or horse, iron and fire being common items of proven efficacy against supernatural forces and are well attested in the Irish corpus of folklore material. There were also strict prohibitions against carrying out certain actions in the household, as water not being allowed to leave the house, nor ashes be taken from the fire. Any person entering the house would have to take a brash, have a go-off churning to make sure they did not intend to steal any of the butter, and it was forbidden to loan a churn. A small note now on the folk tales that involve witches but do not make mention of dairy products or farm animals at all. I have observed that in these cases, the story tends to have a longer narrative, often with named protagonists from a higher class, for whom witches play the antagonist. These stories seem to be different from the ones we have seen concerning butter, in that they involve high-status characters like gentry or even heroes, and not the agrarian peasantry. In short, they appear more legendary and mythical than the domestic and agrarian threats posed by witches we have seen in the previous stories. For example, in one story, the famous Fianna tangles with 3 witches. The witches hound them and carried them away into the darkness. Other Fenians followed in search of them, and they in turn were caught in the trap. Another account tells of ancient Irish royalty. There once was a king in Ireland named Fergal, and he was out hunting, and he came to a house where lived an old hag and her daughter. The daughter was very handsome, and the king brought her and said he would marry her because his own wife was dead. But the daughter would not go without her mother, and he brought the hag and the girl, and she and the king were married. After that, the hag used to go out at midnight every night to the graveyard, where she met several witches, and when she would come back, she always had something bad to say about the king's children, until at last the king put to death. One day the hag had a feast and invited the witches. When the king saw that, he began to complain, and the witches killed him. Then the king's castle disappeared, and it was never known again. Perhaps these stories, which both contain the word old in their titles, recall an earlier oral tradition of powerful female figures who were the foes of heroes and kings, while our butter-thieving, devil-worshipping witches may be the product of early modern Irish society. British colonialism must have caused food anxiety to Irish farmers who were forced to produce butter and other crops as rent to increasingly demanding and oppressive landlords. Despite this observation, it is important to remember that butter churning was present and important in Ireland since prehistoric times, and it is certain that a rich folkloric tradition has always surrounded it. Here we have 2 more examples of the Fianna tangling with specifically 3 witches, so perhaps other versions of the same story. The first one says, one day as Fianna and his chief comrades were hunting at Kesh in County Sligo, they were caught in a magical trap by 3 witches. Across the entrance to a cave, these witches spun yarns of thread like spider's web. So we have another mention to a trap and 3 witches. And then in the second story, a story of Fianna. It's the same story where Fianna and his chief comrades were hunting at Kesh when they were caught in a magical trap by 3 witches. So we see this theme of mythical interactions with heroes and specifically 3 witches, whereas we saw more typically only one single witch in our stories about butter churning and butter stealing. In conclusion, the Irish conception of witches is heavily related to dairy production and May Day. These connections transcend regional divisions to be found in many different areas in Ireland, echoing nearly identical tales of supernatural threats to butter and farm animals. They reveal the anxieties of an agrarian society steeped in folk belief and dairy traditions. Furthermore, the unique folk remedies used by Irish people to combat supernatural threats set Ireland apart from its neighboring witchcraft folklore and may have saved many lives.